The sun beat down on the dusty trail that wound its way through the Ozark Mountains, kicking up little puffs of red earth beneath the sturdy boots of Jed Clampett. He was a man of simple needs and even simpler means, a mountaineer whose life was measured not in coins, but in the rhythm of the seasons and the loyalty of his kin. His wife had long since passed, leaving him to raise his daughter, the spirited and beautiful Ellie Mae, and to provide for his mother-in-law, Granny, a woman whose tongue was as sharp as her homemade lye soap, and whose heart was buried deep beneath layers of stubborn pride. The cabin they called home was a testament to endurance, a weathered structure of logs that had seen better decades, huddled against the side of a mountain that seemed to hold its breath. One afternoon, while Jed was out on the hillside, aiming his old musket at a rabbit for the stew pot, he heard a sound that didn't belong in the quiet stillness of the woods. It was a rhythmic, gurgling thump, a subterranean heartbeat that grew louder with every passing second. He squeezed the trigger, hoping to bag his dinner, but instead of the satisfying thud of lead hitting fur, he was met with a sudden, violent eruption from the earth itself. Black, viscous liquid, thick and pungent, sprayed high into the air, soaking his faded denim overalls and turning the patch of dry dirt into a bubbling, dark pool. Jed stood there, stunned, his hat pushed back on his head, staring at the strange phenomenon. It was oil, plain as the nose on his face, that legendary black gold that folks whispered about in the trading posts, that Texas tea that had made men rich and fools out of paupers. He wiped a handful of the sludge from his cheek, a slow, bewildered grin spreading across his weathered face. He did not know it then, but the life he had known, the life of toil and scarcity, had ended in that very instant, replaced by a future so vast and strange he could not even begin to imagine its shape. When he told the kinfolk, the news rippled through their small world like a pebble dropped in a still pond. His cousin Pearl, a woman with a voice like a foghorn and an opinion on everything, was the first to declare that their days of hardship were numbered. Jed was, as far as the world was concerned, a millionaire, a man whose wealth was now measured in millions of dollars rather than bushels of corn. The neighbors and distant relations, folks who had barely acknowledged their existence when the cupboard was bare, suddenly appeared with advice and well wishes, all of them insisting that a man of Jed's stature could no longer live in the quiet isolation of the hills. California, they told him, was the promised land, a place of palm trees, sunshine, and a life of luxury that befitted his new station. It sounded like a tall tale, but Jed, ever the trusting soul, allowed himself to be swayed. They loaded up the old, battered truck with their meager belongings, balancing their simple mountain gear against the strange, heavy weight of their newfound fortune. As the truck rumbled away from the mountain, leaving behind the only home they had ever known, the air seemed to hum with the electricity of uncertainty and promise. When they arrived in Beverly Hills, the contrast was enough to make one's head spin. The streets were lined with mansions that looked like something out of a dream, and the people moved with a frantic, polished energy that left the Clampetts feeling like fish out of water. They settled into a mansion that felt more like a museum than a home, complete with a swimming pool that was, according to Granny, far too much water for anyone to be splashing around in. Everywhere they looked, there were movie stars, people who seemed to exist in a different reality entirely, and the sheer excess of it all was overwhelming. Yet, even in the midst of this strange new world, the essence of the Clampetts remained unchanged. Jed, despite the millions in the bank, still rose with the sun. His boots still felt most comfortable when they were caked with a bit of dirt, and his devotion to his family was as steady as the mountain air. Ellie Mae, with her love for every creature that scurried or flew, quickly turned the ornate gardens of their Beverly Hills estate into a sanctuary for all manner of wild things, much to the exasperation of their banker, Mr. Drysdale. Mr. Drysdale was a man who lived for the numbers, a man who saw in the Clampetts not just clients, but a source of perpetual anxiety and, occasionally, a genuine sense of wonder. He kept a frantic watch over their massive fortune, his brow permanently furrowed, his hands always trembling slightly as he navigated the complex dance of high finance. To Mr. Drysdale, The millions that sat in his vault were not just money. They were a legacy, a burden of responsibility that he guarded with a ferocity that was almost comical. One morning, the peace of their mansion was shattered by a sudden, peculiar excitement. Granny, who had been grumbling about the lack of real work to be done, had decided that their money was not doing enough good. She had heard a whisper on the wind, a scrap of news from far across the ocean, that the people of England were in dire straits. They were, according to her interpretation of a radio broadcast, so poor that they had been forced to sell their very own queen to the city of Philadelphia, which intended to use her as a tourist attraction. The horror of it hit the household like a thunderclap. Jed, ever the noble soul, could not sit idly by while such an indignity was being suffered. He gathered the family, his expression grave, his resolve hardened by the simplicity of his heart. They were going to save the queen. They would go to England. They would use their fortune to restore the honor of the throne, and they would do it with the same quiet, earnest determination that had led Jed to strike oil in the first place. Mr. Drysdale, upon hearing of this grand plan, was initially aghast. He could not fathom the idea of taking such a massive sum of money and dragging it across the Atlantic, all to fix a problem that he suspected was mostly a misunderstanding. But as he looked at the sincerity in Jed's eyes, as he saw the way the family stood together, united by a singular, noble purpose, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't experienced in years. It was not just the potential for a new business arrangement. It was the realization that there were things in this world more important than the bottom line of a bank statement. The journey to England was, for the Clampetts, a series of surreal encounters and gentle misunderstandings. They arrived in London with their truck, their odd habits, and their unwavering belief that they were the saviors of a fallen crown. They navigated the stuffy halls of power with a grace that was entirely their own, treating dukes and diplomats with the same simple respect they would offer a neighbor back in the hills. They were ridiculed by some, patronized by others, but through it all, they remained true to who they were. In the end, they found that the reality of the situation was far less dire than they had feared. The queen had indeed sold some of her property, but she had not been sold herself, and the dignity of the monarchy remained intact. Yet, the gesture of the Clampetts, their willingness to give everything they had to help a woman they had never met, touched something deep in the heart of the British people. They did not need the money, but they were moved by the spirit behind it. As they prepared to return home, the Clampetts looked out over the rolling green hills of England, the place they had briefly called their own. They had seen the world, they had touched the lives of royalty and commoners alike, but they were still, at their core, the same family that had left the Ozarks in a cloud of dust. They had learned that wealth is not found in the amount of gold one possesses, but in the connections one makes, the kindness one offers, and the integrity one keeps, regardless of the circumstances. They returned to Beverly Hills not as people transformed by their riches, but as people who had tested their values in the wider world and found them to be as strong and enduring as the mountains they once called home. The swimming pools and the movie stars, the bank accounts and the fame, all of it faded into the background when compared to the simple joy of sitting together on the porch, listening to the crickets, and knowing that, no matter where they went or what they did, they would always have each other. And so, the story of the Clampetts continued, a gentle, humorous, and deeply human tale, a reminder that in the corner of every life, there is room for wonder, for love, and for the simple, quiet wisdom of a man named Jed.